Hey there, everyone. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Deborah Bate, and I'm an MPH graduate from this past June. My research interests are in transgender health, and today I'm going to cover a very under-researched area, transgender reproductive rights, specifically concerning involuntary sterilization practices. Involuntary sterilization references both forced or coerced sterilization for trans persons. This has been a fairly common requirement across many countries that offer transgender healthcare services, like transition assistance, or legal recognition status, such as changes to official state documents and identification papers. But why have so many countries insisted on the abdication of fertility for trans persons as a stipulation to receive care or recognition? Well, historically, sterilization was often seen as something that kind of just came with the territory of being a trans person. Infertility came about due to trans men having a hysterectomy and trans women having their testicles removed. In many countries, though, the sterilization requirement was based on an administrative practice from the 1970s. The first law in Western Europe that introduced gender recognition was in 1972 in Sweden. They included forced sterilization, coming clearly from a time where sterilization of other groups in Sweden was in full swing, and this became the blueprint for all other laws in Western Europe. A common argument is that a person's genitals and reproductive organs should match their gender identity. Some see sterilization as proof that a person was very serious about wanting to change gender, and there are those that may just feel anxious about someone who has legally become a man becoming pregnant. However, gender identity is not determined by sexual or reproductive organs, and so the capability to conceive a child is not a matter of identity, but one of bodily autonomy. Sterilization is sometimes a necessary or desired part of medical care for some trans people. This is perfectly reasonable, provided that those individuals can make an informed decision about their fertility and have options to preserve biological material if they so desire. But framing sterilization as a requirement for legal gender recognition reflects a narrow view of understanding gender, one that stringently ties it to a person's genitals rather than a comprehensive and realistic approach that embraces the diversity and understanding of gender identity construction. Though a significant number of trans people do undergo or hope to undergo gender-confirming surgeries, not all trans people wish to have surgery on their genitals or reproductive organs. As an example, there is an estimated 1.4 million trans people in the United States. Roughly a third of them do undergo some type of gender-confirming surgery, such as breast removal or augmentation, or alterations to their genitals. In 2016, there were 3,200 genital gender-confirming surgeries performed in the U.S., with 54% of those performed on trans women. A recent report from the American Society of Plastic Surgeons showed that 14% of trans women patients and 21% of trans men patients are not interested in any type of surgery at all. Some trans individuals are unable to access these surgeries due to a lack of resources or because of conflicting medical conditions, or because they simply don't feel the need to change their genitals in order to identify as their gender. Although exact numbers are not available, according to Transgender Rights Europe, a large majority of trans people utilize hormonal treatments for transition purposes, but stopped there rather than continuing on with surgical procedures. Again, though, this may be due to access or resource restrictions just as much as individual preferences. Even those trans people who do desire some form of genital gender-confirming surgery may still wish to preserve their ability to procreate biologically by banking sperm or cryopreservation of eggs. It can be assumed that trans persons would simply prefer to make the decision on their own terms rather than at the insistence of a government agency. Although specific data from low-income countries isn't available, and most middle-income countries have limited data, Amnesty International attests that the majority of countries worldwide do not offer any legal or administrative measures enabling gender recognition for transgender people. In Europe, 8 states fail to offer legal recognition to trans persons, and 20 states are still imposing sterilization on those seeking gender recognition. In 2010, the Council of Europe's Commission for Human Rights critiqued forced sterilization statutes, describing these laws as provisions which demand impossible choices, affecting an estimated 1.5 million trans persons across the EU. As trans human rights advocates have argued, having to choose to not be eligible for legal recognition or being unnecessarily sterilized is really no choice at all. So looking back to the Swedish context, legislation was passed in 1972 that to obtain legal recognition, a trans person had to undergo a sex change operation and be sterilized in the process, with no system in place to preserve biological material for future use. According to public figures, from 1972 to 2012, 865 Swedish citizens applied for legal gender change, and 500 of them went through the mandatory sterilization requirement. This law was repealed in December of 2012, when it was ruled that the provision was in conflict with the Swedish Constitution and the recommendations of the SRHR. This was a positive step to bring Swedish law into line with the country's aspirations to be a leader on LGBTQ rights at the international level. So the provision is no longer legally in effect. But what is the reality for trans persons in Sweden? Gender-confirming surgery is still the assumed norm, that it's obviously a desired end goal. Trans persons currently still have to go through psychological assessments to obtain medical treatments needed for their transition. And it's not uncommon that when a trans person indicates that they don't want to have genital surgery, or that they would like to find a way to preserve their reproductivity or biological material, they're met with questions on the validity of their gender identity, as though these desires or concerns cast doubt on a person really being trans. This in turn can delay or even halt their transition process if the psychological assessment team doubts the trans person's intentions. Furthermore, the option of preserving biological material is not a standard offer. Trans persons have to navigate the system to request these options, and often again are met with resistance and doubts of their identity. So the law says one thing, but practice is still holding on to the old assumptions that affect adherence to the law. In April of this year, the SRHR ruled that the sterilization requirement violates human rights, and that the remaining 20 EU countries that still use the infertility statute must change their laws and end this practice. As we've seen in Sweden, though, changing the law is really only the first step. Practices need to be amended as well. Now, what does this mean for us in public health? It means we need more education and public engagement on the understanding of gender identity to help shape policies that are non-discriminatory towards already marginalized populations. We need more research into other areas of transgender health, which currently primarily focuses on HIV/STI concerns, violence or harassment, stigma, and mental health evaluations, which are all vital issues, but they don't reflect the totality of trans lives. And then we also need advocates within the professional health community to ensure that once laws or policies are in place, the day-to-day practices align with them. If you would like to learn more about preservation practices for trans individuals, or to read further on the existing research, I've provided a list of resources to Marcus where you can obtain more information. Thank you so much for your time. Best of luck to you in your second year. Take care.